Hello and welcome to the first lesson in our study of international space law. What we're going to do in this lesson is ask a few basic questions for this series of lessons and then just outline the scope of this subject, a subject that I'm sure a lot of you would have never had any kind of interaction with. I myself never had any kind of interaction with until doing a lot of prep and reading for this series of lessons, and one that is arguably one of the most interesting areas of law, at least very one of the most interesting areas of international law that we can actually study. So that's why we're starting with space law so early on. So essentially, we're going to be taking a look at the law of outer space from an international perspective. And we will focus on the fact that there are a lot of domestic developments in terms of the regulation of outer space activity that have been taking place and taking shape over the last few decades. But we're going to try and be as international as possible. This is the International Law Academy, so we have to focus on international law as much as we can. This lesson specifically, we're just going to ask what is space law, why is space law so important, and then finally, what are the topics of study, i.e. what is the scope of international space law, at least what we're going to cover in this series of lessons. We're not going to cover everything because there's actually a lot that you might not think there is a lot, but there is actually quite a lot of subjects that we can study for space law. So that's essentially the purpose of this lesson. What is space law? The first question that we need to answer. Well, simply put, as the name would suggest, space law is the law regulating space-related activities. That's about it in terms of its scope. We don't have to finish here, but we will carry on. For the most part, space law is regulated from both, like I said, an international and a domestic perspective. And it is, in fact, the domestic perspective that we have seen a lot of developments in recent decades. As new technologies have developed and further interests in outer space activities have continued to increase, not quite to the same kind of extent as the kind of 1960s space race during the Cold War, possibly, arguably, we've seen at least a lot of domestic regulation, or at least further indications that we're going to see domestic reforms relating to interspace activities. And so, in fact, when we talk about the developments in space law from a domestic perspective, we have to look at very recent developments, essentially. We've seen numerous developments take place. But interestingly, space law itself sits almost as an intersection between a number of different disciplines, because it is something that will cross over into other disciplines and to other issues. So, for example, space law is important for the study of the environment, the ways in which we regulate the outer space as an environmental policy is very, very important. Commercial exploitation or commercial law, as we start to see more and more development and commercial activity take place in outer space, we're going to see commercial law relating to space regulation be more and more prominent. But then we also have things like military technology, because a lot of the time, there is actually a lot of interest in outer space when it comes to the ways in which the military can utilize space for particular purposes. And then finally, we have dispute settlement within space-related activities, and even criminal practice. There was a criminal case very recently that we're going to focus on, maybe as a little side lesson, just mainly for a bit of fun, really. But for the most part, we're talking about space law, but we're actually focusing on lots of different elements of space law, like environmental protection, like commercial exploitation, like the use of military technology, the use of information technology as well. So that's the first question answered. What about the second question? The question being, why is space law so important? Why is it important? Well, I put in brackets, I would argue that it is one of, if not the most important areas of study to anybody who is interested in any area of law. Not necessarily because of its particular relevance at the moment, although it is growing in relevance, but because of its future relevance. And we also have other reasons. Relatively speaking, space law is a new endeavour. We will note that a lot of the treaties and regulation that exist in international space law are old and haven't changed in a very long time. Now, what is important that we need to remember is that while this is the case, there is new revived interest in interspace activities that have been taking place over the last few decades. And so therefore, it is a new endeavour to see how these new things are going to be regulated, especially things like commercial regulation of space law is something that is going to be very much a future development that will take place. So that is one of the reasons why space law is so important, because while it is quite old in terms of some of the older treaties and older regulations and agreements and principles that exist, they are going to become more and more prominent. Space law is going to become a much more prominent area of law as time goes on. Outer space activities, like I said, will become increasingly more important in the future. We have seen already that in the last decade or so, the growth of private commercial industries like SpaceX, in terms of their ability to launch satellites into space and their new technologies that have made space exploration a lot cheaper. We've seen as well space programs being developed by countries like China, by countries like India, as well as NASA. Launching or going towards launching a new space-related program going to the moon, going back to the moon, at least potentially sending not necessarily people to the moon, but sending technology to the moon. We've seen as well in this year, the time of recording is in 2022, the end of 2022, we've seen the opening and the launching of the James Webb Telescope. All of these different things are all areas of law, all areas of science, should I say, that are going to be regulated and going to need to be regulated by space law. So, with that being said, with the importance of space law out of the way and the definition of space law, what is the scope of international space law for this series of lessons? What are we actually going to cover in terms of the substantive processes? Well, just like with all of our other studies of international law, we'll begin by taking a look at some of the basic features of the area. So, we'll talk about the historical development of space law and interest in outer space. We're also going to talk about the sources of the formal sources of international space law. Now, just like with international humanitarian law or international criminal law or public international law, the sources of international space law, as you can probably imagine, are going to be very similar. They're going to involve treaties, they're going to involve general principles, they're going to involve international custom, as you can probably imagine. But we'll just cover them anyway, and we'll focus on some of the specific treaties that are very much, or at least are very much of importance for space law. Then, when we talk about the second of these major topics, we're going to talk about the nature of outer space as a legal entity. So we're going to be asking questions like, for example, where does space begin? That's a far more controversial question than you might think. And what right do we have to use and enjoy outer space? What kinds of things can we focus on if, instead of looking at space as a scientific endeavour or an exploratory endeavour, let's think about space as a legal entity, as a legal process, as a legal space, just like how we used to think of, for example, the sea and the ocean. There is regulation, and we can look at the sea and the ocean as a legal entity if we were doing, for example, international law of the sea. Similar thing is going to be done here. We're going to talk about space as a legal entity. Where does it begin? What actually is it as a legal entity? What rights do we have in terms of the use and enjoyment of outer space as individuals? So we'll look at other elements of outer space as well, such as celestial bodies. So we're not just going to focus on space as the sort of ethereal concept that we see here, the black bit at the top of this screen. We're going to focus as well on celestial bodies that exist as well. So, for example, we can look at space as a legal entity, but what about, for example, the moon as a legal entity? How does that operate? What rights do we have over the moon? Section 3, we'll look at the law relating to man-made objects in space. So we'll talk about, for example, spacecraft, as well as a lecture on the legal status of the International Space Station, the ISS, and the way in which law is regulated for the ISS. We won't go into that much detail about the law of the ISS. We'll just do a general overview lesson on that. Or maybe 2 lessons on that, just because the law of the ISS is actually, you can actually buy a textbook on that in and of itself, and so I'm not going to try and condense that down into one single lesson, or try and teach it all, which would involve making about 40 lessons just on ISS law. But we'll also focus as well talking about other man-made objects like satellites as well, and other things relating to that. So, Section 4 is the section that is going to start to talk about some more of the intersectional elements of international space law. So we'll focus on, for example, environmental elements of international space law, looking at the regulation of harmful environmental practices. One of the major and one of the largest problems that we're going to see in the development of interspace activities is this idea of pollution and littering in outer space. The idea of the fact that we're getting more and more and more debris building up around the atmosphere, around the orbit of the planet. And so therefore this is going to be constituting a harmful environmental process. And so what's important is how that is going to be regulated in the future, as well as regulating other elements. So, for example, the use of certain conventional or non-conventional weapons in outer space, and how that can do damage to the environment as well. And that ties us quite nicely into section 5, which will see our study of international regulation of outer space for the use of military purposes. What can a military do in outer space for example, the testing of nuclear weapons, the usages of nuclear weapons, the usages of satellites for military purposes? What kind of law do we see regulated there? And then finally, section 6 will just look at the use of and the ways in which there is the regulation of international settlements of disputes for outer space related activities. So how does dispute settlement operate? What kinds of panels, tribunals, courts exist for the settlement of disputes? And more importantly, what kinds of panels, tribunals or courts could exist in the future for the international settlement of space related disputes?